So first, I'd say companies need to find a way, and they can all come up with their own if they want, to assess the risk associated with local permitting. That means taking a really close and detailed look at exactly what kind of permits you're going to need, exactly what kind of ordinances are or are not in place, where you're going to have to go to get your approvals, and how easily the rules can change on you and when. So depending on where you are in this country, the answers to those questions are very different.
And this is Scaling Clean, the podcast for clean economy CEOs, investors, and the people who advise them. I'm your host, Mike Casey. My day job is running TigerCom, a firm that counsels companies that are helping move the U.S. economy onto a more sustainable footing. I get to meet the people who are succeeding at building, funding, or advising the most successful companies in your sectors. So each show, we try to bring you usable insights from these leaders so you can apply them to the business of running your business. Hey, Clean Techers, as we pass the one-year mark for the Inflation Reduction Act, we're seeing increased resistance to the clean energy transition driven by incumbent sectors. Of the 9 major barriers to the transition, there remains a consensus that community engagement, the precursor to successful permitting, is the first among equals for these challenges. And among those who lead community engagement efforts for renewable energy developers, all of them, and I mean all of them, tell us their jobs are harder and communities are more difficult to win over. So it seemed like an ideal time to talk with our longtime friend and fellow traveler, Dahvi Wilson. Dahvi recently left her post as the head of public affairs for Apex Clean Energy. Her department included state and federal policy as well as local community engagement. And over a decade, she built and ran what is widely regarded as the biggest, best funded, and well-staffed local engagement operation in the industry. I wanted to talk to Dahvi to tap her experience for lessons learned for the growing ranks of community engagement leads that will be gathering at RE Plus soon. Many of those leads have met Dahvi, but perhaps few have ever had a reason to ask her for her lessons learned. So that's what we're going to do today. Dahvi, thanks for talking with us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
All right, let's start by having you tell us about the program you just left. And to the extent you can, tell us about its structure and why you built it as you did. I want to really know what made Apex's program different.
Yeah, sure. So Apex Clean Energy has a really world-class public affairs function, and it's changed a lot over the years as we developed it. It started really as an entirely third-party consultant-driven program. Back in about 2013, when we started to work on this, we were building from nothing, and we worked with some great grassroots firms early on that helped us learn how to do this work, understand what it looks like to do it well, and also taught us that if you can bring it in-house, you get some extra benefits, if that's possible, just greater coordination and unification with the rest of the team. And so that's the direction that we went. We started with consultants and then eventually built our own team that grew over time till it was about 25 people when I left Apex in April. And that was just the public engagement function, which partnered with the development teams, the development team members from the company out in the field. We structured that team really based on a political campaign structure. So we really built our public engagement team based on a campaign team structure. And the reason for that was that we learned over time in some of our earlier experiments that we really needed campaign-minded folks out in the field. So politically minded folks who were used to thinking with a campaign mentality. And what we mean by that was folks who were really used to building a whole strategy around a very clear endpoint. In the case of a clean energy project, it was often the local permit or permits that were needed. And so they would know how to design a campaign to support a good outcome on a permit. And to do that, you need to understand who's giving you the permit and how many people are involved in that vote and what those people think and who they listen to. And so these campaign types knew how to do that kind of analysis and design a strategy that fit. So we ended up learning that lesson early on and then realized that carried all the way through to the structure of the team. And we ended up building a team structure that looks a lot like a campaign team structure. So something like a campaign manager, something like a field director, and something like a field organizer that's out on the ground really working, to execute all of the campaign strategies. I should just say one thing that makes the Apex team unique is its size. I think people can be shocked sometimes when they hear about how big the team is. But the reason for that is that Apex was developing hundreds of projects at a time, with about 50 to 60 developers on the team. And when you have that level of engagement with communities, you just really need a lot of people to do that job. And we can talk more about this later, but there really is not a great way to decrease the amount of human resource that you need to put on this. It's just a very high intensity type of work.
All right, I want to drill on something you just said. I think there's a lot of people who are on development teams who are doing the community engagement end of it. And for them, there's a mixture of feelings like, wow, this has gotten a lot more political or campaign like, and I don't have any training or background in that. So that's sort of one source of concern that we hear. Another source of concern, surprisingly prevalent, is companies will say, well, treating community engagement like a political campaign clashes with our company values. I suspect when people hear that, they think politics is dirty, it's corrupt, it means giving money to politicians to get them to do things. When you say community engagement structured and built like a political campaign, tell me what you mean by that, because I think that's important for people who are in these companies who maybe don't have a lot of familiarity with working professionally in politics, what that's actually like. So could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So when I say campaign mindset or political campaign orientation, it's really about the tools that are needed to get the job done and the strategy development. So from a strategic perspective, as I was saying, the strategy of let me go in a different direction. The strategy of a comms campaign, of a communications campaign, might be, I want to know how many people are seeing my message. I want to understand how my message is affecting their positions and opinions about me. These are the kinds of metrics that you might be using to assess a communications campaign. And so you would build a campaign strategy to try to maximize those metrics. But on the political side, it's not the same set of metrics, and it's not the same kind of strategy. And so I think it's an important distinction. On the campaign side, again, you're starting ideally from, what is the outcome that I need? Where is the venue that's going to determine that outcome? Who is the individual that is going to vote? And now, once I understand that, I'm going to design a campaign timeline based on when the vote is and what I need to get done in time to be prepared for that vote. I'm going to design the strategies to make sure that I'm producing the assets that I need in order to get that outcome. So by assets, I mean, like, do you need a certain number of supporters who are ready to show up at a hearing? Or do you need a lot of letters to go to this one elected official? Or, is there one person who this elected official really trusts and you just need that person to talk to them? And that kind of campaign decision making is all rooted in that, keeping an eye on that outcome. So that's one thing I mean by political campaign, that kind of orientation towards that specific outcome, and really strategic about what activities you pursue to get that outcome. And then the other thing I mean by it is, like I said, the tools. So the tools of the campaign that we used often were things like canvassing, talking to a lot of people, phone polls, or phone surveys to talk to a lot of people, tools like training events where you're helping to bring supporters together and help give them the messages that they need and the information that they need to help communicate accurate information, and also to help them meet each other and feel supported and showing up for something in the community. And those kinds of strategies are a little bit different than a lot of more traditional communication strategies. So that's really what I mean. And sometimes it does actually become politics. There are elections that decide these things. And there are ballot issues coming up in several places where that's where permit decisions are being made, more or less. So there are real elections, like literal elections happening too. But what I meant more was that sort of orientation towards the work.
Everyone agrees community engagement has gotten harder. I'd like to hear from you why you think that is. In other words, what's driving this increase in the degree of difficulty that many of your former peers are experiencing?
It's a good question, and I think it has several answers. On For one thing, I think the development community is feeling increasingly like opportunities are very constrained. So there's more demand than there's ever been. The IRA was amazing in opening up a lot of new financial opportunity, but physically, the places you can put these things are getting fewer and fewer. And they're primarily, I think, the biggest constraint on that is transmission. So if you're a project that's trying to connect to the grid, which is most utility scale projects, there just are very few places you can go. There's a much more limited set of places. So what happens is all of the developers go there, and there's a tremendous amount of pressure on those communities. So, now if a community is having a project proposed in their jurisdiction, it's quite likely that their neighbors had it recently, like neighboring counties have had it recently. Maybe they've had more than one company approach. Maybe they already have a project and they're having more projects approach. And it's just putting a lot of pressure on those same places and those same regions. The other reason is, I think, over time, there's been a blossoming of misinformation and disinformation on the internet, so that when people go to search for information about a project that's being proposed near them or something they heard about, it's not hard to find a lot of information that's really scary. And regardless of whether it's true or not, there are individuals who are posting things that seem very scary. And so I think that's an element too, because now there's just so much content available to spread around if you legitimately become concerned, or if you just become opposed to a project that you don't want. You can go find a lot of information quickly that helps you, convert others to your cause, I think. So I think that that's an element too. There's just been a sort of ever increasing amount of that content available. And then last, there is a contagiousness to this. I think communities that are next door to other communities where opposition has emerged, tend to, I think, be influenced by that. And so we just are seeing a sort of spread that's sort of exponential, I think, in how it's happening.
Thanks for that. Really appreciate it. So, from research we've recently conducted, we know that rural Americans do not materially differentiate between one developer and another. Basically, all the developers are viewed as an industry rather than a significantly different company from one to the next. So, based on your experience in trade association meetings of your peers, how do you think the industry is doing managing this increased community acceptance difficulty?
Yeah, it definitely varies from company to company. So even if people don't recognize that, it's definitely true. But I think the industry has been disappointingly slow at taking this seriously. To be fair to the industry, there are so many uncertainties involved with developing a clean energy project. Developers by nature have to be optimistic because it's really challenging to get through all of those and to retain hope in a project enough to see it through. But I think that attitude was a real disadvantage when it came to these local acceptance issues, because they tended to push them aside and, I think, figure that they would deal with them later, sort of. That was something that could be overcome later, or wasn't as big of an issue. But in the meantime, so many companies have lost projects that it's pretty clear that wasn't the right strategy. I think there's a lot of good knowledge among several companies, and also many of the consultants that serve companies, about how to do a better job of not only not only organizing in a community, but also engaging the community. So I think there are really good resources to tap into, but I think it's expensive. Well, actually, let me correct that. It's not actually on absolute terms. It is not expensive. If you compare the cost of doing a good job at this to other things that developers are very used to spending money on, like turbine deposits or panel deposits or wildlife studies, it's actually not very much money. But it's definitely more expensive than they're used to thinking this kind of work should be.
Yeah, for
And it
sure.
takes a lot of people. And so, you know, companies need to invest. And in my experience, there are a number of companies who have staff who are out there in the field who are trying to advocate for that kind of resource, and they're struggling to get support from their leadership. Maybe because the leadership doesn't fully understand, what this looks like on the ground. But like I said earlier, I don't think there's a way to automate this or shortcut having real people out on the ground building real relationships. And so there just isn't a low human resource way to really do that. So that's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, I think, for the industry. But I'm hoping that they're learning it now and that they're jumping in, and more companies seem to be, as you mentioned earlier, putting a focus on this and figuring out how to build a function in their company that can do this kind of work.
Our view is that common development practices were established in a less difficult environment. In some respects, you can, with the benefit of hindsight, you can say that clean energy's original sin was assuming low friction permitting. And now community acceptance has, as you've noted, taken on qualities of a local electoral campaign. Looking back at your time sitting in industry committees with your peers, listening to their experiences, with the benefit of hindsight, what would you say are the top three things any company looking to upgrade their community acceptance programs
Hmm.
should do?
Yeah. So first, I'd say companies need to find a way, and they can all come up with their own if they want, to assess the risk associated with local permitting. That means taking a really close and detailed look at exactly what kind of permits you're going to need, exactly what kind of ordinances are or are not in place, where you're going to have to go to get your approvals, and how easily the rules can change on you and when. So, depending on where you are in this country, the answers to those questions are very different. Everybody needs to know, you need to know from a very early stage what it's going to take for you to get the approvals you need in the county where you are. In my experience, it was not unusual to, when we started to do a scan of what kind of permits would be needed, that we would get data back that said you will need a county permit. But that is not a sufficient amount of detail to be able to assess your risk in that county. You don't just need to know that you need a county permit. You need to know what permit. Is it a special use permit? Is it a conditional use permit? Is it, an agreement or a series of agreements? You need to know what board is responsible for giving that agreement or permit. And in many cases, it's more than one board. Like there might be a planning board and a county commission. You need to know if there's an ordinance in place, and if there is it workable? And if it's not, how do you change it? You need to know if there's zoning in place. If there's not, you need to know what they have to do to put zoning in place. Like you need to understand the full landscape of how laws are written around local siting and permits are granted. And the reason why you need to know that is because over the course of your project development cycle, you are going to be there for years, and there are many things that can happen between the day that you start and the day that you build. So it's very helpful to know what all of those venues are going to be, who all the people are who are going to be involved, and to accurately assess your risk, you really do kind of need to know that. That's your exposure. So that's a first part to assessing risk, but also related to that are your permit, your specific permit venue risk is one area of risk, but you also need to take a look at other things that can increase the risk that you're going to have a lot of pushback in a community. those might be cultural aspects of the community, or it might be physical attributes of the location. But you want to be, there are ways you can anticipate where you're likely to face more pushback. And you should incorporate that very early on into your planning, because if there's a place where you have a high risk that there's going to be opposition, there's going to be pushback, or the decision makers are going to be highly influenced, or you're just going to have a whole lot of steps along the way where you're going to be in front of the public, and angry people can really have a big impact. You need to kind of know that, because if you are in a high risk project, you should be planning to budget more from the beginning. You should be out even earlier. You should be prepared to put even more human resources onto that project. And you should be very strategic about how you roll it out from day one. I mean, one of the things we definitely learned at Apex was first impressions matter. And so if you don't have a plan before your first person, whether that's a land agent or a developer, sets foot in that community, you could already be behind by the time that they do. That level of attention is not necessary everywhere, but if you don't have a way of assessing risk, you don't know which places it's necessary in and which places it's not. So that's number one. Find a way to assess your risk from the beginning. Number two, build a campaign strategy to meet your risk and put the resources in to match the risk. That's not to say you should be absent in a place that's lower risk. It just means that you might not need a full campaign infrastructure in place to succeed there and to provide the kind of engagement with the community that is needed there. But if it's a place where you anticipate that there's going to be a lot of controversy, you want to make sure you've put the people in place and you've given them what they need to build the relationships that are going to protect you and help get your supporters identified and turned out down the road when you need them at your permit hearing. So that would be number two. What would number three be? Number three would be buckle up, because it's going to last. Once you are present and public in a place, it doesn't end. There is no end to that. You have to remain engaged, and you have to stay present, and you have to be prepared to continue to invest until hopefully until the project is decommissioned. That there's some level of engagement happening, but certainly throughout the life of the development process. If you disappear, things don't get better for you. I've heard some people say maybe we should just let this simmer down a little, and we'll step back and let everybody's temperature come down. And that's a nice idea. In my experience, it doesn't work that way. It does not calm down. There's one direction that this goes. It gets more and more intense as you get closer to construction. And so if you're getting engaged, prepare to stay engaged. I think that would be number three.
Boy, I tell you, I think that last lesson is so important. I am, as you do, I am wholly devoted to this industry. I absolutely love it. I believe in it. I've devoted my life to it. But I must say there are things it does that completely mystify me. I do not understand why any asset owner in this country does not have a visitor center and a program to grow, curate, and document public support for your current operating asset. Because when you ghost your host community on an operating asset, all that's going to happen, to your point, is the NIMBYs and the disaffected are going to fill in the verdict. And it just is a mystery to me why we're not rewarding a county commissioner who voted with you 3 years ago. You owe it to them to help him or her document the good things that have come from tax revenue into that county. It's political malfeasance to just ignore them and go, hey, thanks for doing that. You're still getting stink eye at church or the diner, but we're operating and having a great time. Thanks. It's just because every time we get a dust cloud around a project, that dust cloud drifts over to state capitals. And you're also losing the ability to use happy project neighbors as validators to people who are evaluating whether or not to have you as a neighbor in their community. Do you have any sense of why that
Yeah.
is? Why we just ignore communities that host our operating assets?
Yeah, I do have some theories. But I want to correct one thing that just to make sure everybody hears this. The social science research that's been done on acceptance of built projects shows that the majority of people around built projects are fine with them.
Yes.
So it's not the case. It's not the case that built projects are generating lots of new opposition after they've been built. That's not happening. In fact, it seems like things for the most part get a lot calmer after a project is built. There is evidence from
Yes.
that research that if you were opposed during development, you probably there's a decent chance you stay opposed after development, but that's certainly not true for everyone. And some people we've heard several anecdotes about people who expected the worst and and just acclimated to a new circumstance. So that's important. But I do think that you're right that there has not been a significant focus on sort of stewarding or continuing to feed like a support system once a project is built. And I think that the reason why is it's just sort of mechanical. It's that there's a different group of people who are responsible for operating a project than the group of people who are responsible for developing a project. And they're different types of people. It's a different kind of job. And once a project is built, it's a power plant. And the people who run power plants are very focused on safety, as they should be, cost, as they should be. They are engineers managing an asset. And it's not their instinct to draw a lot of attention to themselves. I think in my experience, um, there was sort of a feeling among operators that if people don't, if people know that we're here, it's because something is wrong. And it's better if they don't even think about us. And so there was not an instinct to go out and make a lot of noise. But you're right that the problem with that is that those built projects are the successes of an industry that is producing new tax revenue for schools and is changing community budgets and is supporting jobs and helping families keep farms and all those things. But if you don't continue the work of tracking those impacts and sharing those impacts, the community forgets about them. They don't know those things are happening. When was the last time you looked at your school district's budget to figure out how much of the money was coming from, the Walmart that got put in down the street? You didn't. Nobody knows that. So it's the same with these. You don't People don't know what the benefits are, and this strategy of maybe they won't notice us if we don't say anything is actually detrimental. We want communities to know what the benefits are, and in fact, it's really important that they do because there's going to be another community that's thinking about a project, or even that community might get another project proposed, and if they don't know and can't see what the benefits of that were, they sure as hell can see the factory. They can see the infrastructure. If they can't see the benefit, it's going to be they're not going to be as eager to support that kind of project. So it is a miss, and I think before I left Apex, we were starting to build out a function that was focused on community engagement for built projects, where our hope was that we would be regularly communicating with folks. We would be updating them on the benefits that had been produced for their community by the project over the last year, what have you, and really trying to stay in touch and provide opportunities to gather with the community. We were talking about things like annual reports to document what kind of emission savings and tax benefits the projects had produced. But we were just starting that, and I don't know how many companies have that, but I think you asked why. I think it's because it's just really rooted in like the nature of the teams right now that run those facilities.
True or false? Political campaigns are, in effect, being run against developers.
True. I think you could say grassroots campaigns are.
And tell our listeners, what's Dahvi Wilson up to now?
I recently started a small consulting business called Siting Clean, and it's really focused exclusively on local siting related issues with clean energy. I There are suddenly, especially after the IRA passed, a lot of folks who are realizing that the future of clean energy transition, the potential for deployment of clean energy in this country is really dependent on these local siting decisions. And they're suddenly, quite suddenly, becoming very interested in engaging. And that's everything from academics to philanthropy to nonprofits to corporations, who are all trying to figure out what their part is to play in this field. So, Exciting Clean is working on helping to advise those groups on where they can fit, what else is going on, trying to promote collaboration between different actors who are interested in this space, trying to educate newcomers about what permitting at the local level it really looks like for clean energy projects, and trying to help companies think about how they might build these functions out inside their teams.
Hey, are you going to be at RE Plus, by the way?
I'm not at RE Plus.
Boo. Man, all right. Bumming me out. Well, Dahvi Wilson, this has been an amazing conversation. I could go for another 30 minutes here because I share your passion for this challenge the industry is facing. And I think that it's a real area of potential growth and sophistication for the companies that make it up. And first, I want to say thanks for the work you did for over a decade, really pushing the frontier of how renewable energy development can be better and better engage these rural communities we're asking to consider so much infrastructure. So first, thanks. And I just hope you all the success in the world in your new endeavor. And thanks for talking to us, Dahvi.
Thank you so much.
This is Scaling Clean, a production of TigerCom, and I'm Mike Casey. Thanks for joining us. You can subscribe to our show free anywhere you get your podcasts. And while you're there, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening.